slowly making our way through the book of Acts, and we're not hitting every verse by verse. We don't really want to dedicate that much time to it in terms of, we could be in the book of Acts for a year or two if we covered, verse by verse. So we're kind of hitting some of the high points. 2 weeks ago, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, if you were here, we covered the topic in Acts 15, and the sermon title was, "What are the rules?" So there's a big deliberation between the Jews and the Gentiles. And for a Gentile, what's a Gentile? A non-Jew. We can substitute the word heathen, pagan, non-Jew, whatever you want to use, it's the same thing. Okay, so anybody that's a non-Jew, what do they have to do to become Christians? The Jewish Christians, those that were born Jewish and converted to Christianity or decided to follow Jesus, they thought there were certain rules that everybody should follow. And then others thought, well, no, we don't have to do that. Peter, the apostle, has a vision one night. In that vision, he sees a sheep drop down from heaven with all kinds of animals in it. And the vision said, Peter, go, kill and eat. And Peter in his head's like, no way. I'm not going to eat that pig. I'm not going to eat that horse. I'm not going to do it. And then it dropped down again. Peter, kill and eat. And Peter's like, no way. I've never eaten an unclean animal. I've never eaten an animal that's unclean, one that has a closed hoof. Okay, Jews were only allowed to eat animals that had split hooves. And God says to Peter, what I have made clean, don't call unclean. And then it dropped down a third time. And finally Peter realizes, okay, I get it, God. And then he has a calling and a vision to say, go and talk to this Gentile. Now, Jewish people were not allowed to enter Gentile homes. But clearly he was being directed to do that. And it goes back to the point in the vision, don't call something unclean that I have made clean. In other words, God was telling Peter, the Gentiles are now clean. There's no longer a separation between you and Gentiles. So Gentiles received the Holy Spirit. Gentiles were worshiping God, and they were welcomed in. But the question was, what did those Gentiles have to do? So there end up being a council at Jerusalem, and you can see the original photograph of that day on the front of your bulletin. There's the Council of Jerusalem taking place. You see Paul, and you see Peter, and you see James, the brother of Jesus, and you see other leaders of the early church making the decision, trying to come to terms with what do Gentiles need to do to be Christians. And in review, in case you weren't here that Sunday, there were 4 rules. Can anybody remind me of any of those 4 rules that they had to follow from the Council of Jerusalem? I didn't think so that's okay. So this is what the verse says. And so, this is James, the brother of Jesus, talking, the leader of the Jerusalem church, in Paul's presence, in Peter's presence. And so my judgment is that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write and tell them to abstain from 1, eating food offered to idols, 2, from sexual immorality, 3, from eating the meat of strangled animals, and 4, from consuming blood. Those are 4 rules that are in all the Old Testament laws as well, but for whatever reason, they applied to the Gentiles becoming Christians. Those are the 4 rules. So I gave that sermon or that message 2 weeks ago. On the way home, Mom's like, that's very interesting, but why strangled animals? Why strangled animals? And she goes, what about chickens? Are we allowed to eat chickens? I'm like, I don't understand, Mom. Why are you asking that question? Well, we used to just twist their neck and we eat the chicken. So I never thought about it. And I really never thought about that until Mom brought it up. And I just said, okay. You know what's funny in this world? I've said this many times. God gave us rules and regulations, some dietary restrictions, some health restrictions, some agricultural restrictions for our own good, for our own benefit. In this day and age, we always want to ask the word why. And I don't see the why being asked in the Old Testament. So I wish I would have been there at the Council of Jerusalem to ask these questions specifically as to why. So after Mom asked that question, I started going on Google, I started doing all kinds of other stuff. There's all kinds of deliberation. There's no clear consensus as to why these were so important. But here's my analogy I want to tell you. Years ago, we had goats. And as a father, I want to take care of my kids and I want to take care of the goats. I set up an electric fence around that buck's pen, that stupid buck we had that wanted to kill me all the time. I put an electric fence up around the pen. I said, Ann, Sean, don't touch the electric fence. I'm just giving them a rule. They could have said, why? And I'm sure they did. And I said, because it's going to shock you. But the fact that the Father has spoken should be enough to satisfy the kids. It's not. It's not enough to satisfy me. It's not enough to satisfy anybody. I said, Sean, don't pee on the electric fence. Well, why? Well, try it and see, Sean. Try it and see. That should have been my response, right? You give rules, and sometimes we ask why, and sometimes we don't. But when a father gives fatherly advice, it's for our own benefit. God gave us so many rules in the Old Testament. I am not a scholar on the book of Leviticus, but if you want to be bored, maybe, or if you're just really interested in this, read the book of Leviticus and read through all the laws he gave us. Some make sense to me, some don't. The law of circumcision, for example, we're going to talk about here in a second. And that was the whole big reason behind the Council in Jerusalem. Do Gentiles, pagans, heathens, do they need to be circumcised or not? Why did God want the Hebrews to be circumcised? Well, it could have been because it's a sign of the covenant. And that should be enough for any of us in this room to say, okay, God, you want us to do it? We'll do it. That should be the case. There's health benefits behind circumcision. There's even more health benefits behind circumcision when you do it at day 6 as opposed to when you're 60 years old. 60-year-old adult males getting circumcised, it can be problematic from a health perspective. God gave us these rules to help us. Oh, I remember one day I planted a fruit tree in our old Swayze house, and my buddy says, hey, it was year 1 and it's growing an apple. My buddy says, hey, you gonna eat that apple? I go, you bet you I'm gonna eat that apple. Well, you're not supposed to. Leviticus tells us not to eat it for 3 years. I looked that up before this message. It's true. It's in Leviticus. Don't eat the fruit from your fruit trees for 3 years. That's stupid. I'm going to eat that apple anyway. As soon as I see that baby, I'm eating it. As soon as it's ripe, I'm going to eat it. Why do you think God told his people not to eat the fruit for 3 years? We got any farmers in here? Anybody? Unless you're an avid gardener, go ahead.
I would just say this is just my guess, because are you going to use the seeds to plant more trees? I don't know.
Because that is a logical guess, a good guess. Okay? A lot of times when you plant, I got strawberries this year, planted strawberries in these raised bed gardens. They tell you not to eat the berries first year. Why? Why? Are those berries bad? Are they going to kill me? No. Huh?
They usually grow bigger after.
They grow bigger after. You want to pull those berries off so the plants can focus on root development. And in future years, you got better strawberry plants. Don't eat the fruit of the apple tree. You want to pull those apples off as soon as they get there so they can focus on root development and grow bigger, stronger, better trees. God was looking out for us in all kinds of ways that we don't sometimes take in consideration. Here's another one, and I've mentioned this several times, but it's probably because it just baffles me. Bathe in water. What else would they bathe in? Huh?
Romans bathe in oil.
Oil? Blood? Some of those pagan cults over there were bathing in blood. Animal fat? People today still do that in Africa. They'll take animal fat, rub it all over their bodies, and that protects their skin, and they just bathe. So God's telling us, take a bath in water. Huh. They didn't say why. I mean, at least it's not spelled out in the old, well, why, God? Why do we want water? Well, because it's to help. No, because God said to bathe in water. Right? This should be good enough for all of us. So let's go back to these 4 things. Because Mom brought it up. You can thank this message to Mom, because she's the one that asked the question. Abstain from food offered to idols. Why do we abstain from food offered to idols? Now you got to realize all these things are directed to these pagan cultures who, God probably wanted to prevent the mixture of the paganism and Christianity, I'm guessing. But all 4 things were happening in pagan cultures. Why do we abstain from food offered to idols? If the Satanic Church down the road invited me for a pitch-in lunch next Wednesday, I don't know what day they worship, I'm just making this up, right? Is it because there's something magical in that food that's going to harm me why I shouldn't eat that food? No, I don't believe that. There's nothing. magical in that food. But the fact is, it's serving a purpose that's not God-honoring, okay? And it could be made by rules and dietary restrictions that are not God-honoring or God-pleasing, and God told us not to do it. We don't know how they butchered their animals, okay? So you don't do it, okay? It should be enough that God said, don't do it, so I won't do it. From sexual immorality. Well, why, God? Why sexual immorality? What could possibly go wrong? If you're the father talking to the kids and you're trying to give them a better life, what could possibly go wrong? Oh, I don't know. Unexpected pregnancies, marital problems, divorces, AIDS, syphilis, gonorrhea, all kinds of things could go wrong. God's wanting to protect his children. Simple as that. That should be plain enough. From eating the meat of strangled animals and from consuming blood. Okay, what can go wrong with consuming blood? Diseases. I mean, that's the number one, right? Disease. And blood is symbolic of life. So when you're drinking blood of an animal, it's like you're consuming the life of the animals. That's not God-honoring. But let's go to the meat of strangled animals here. It's funny how we had the fellowship yesterday. We're cleaning up. Around our table was Daryl, myself, and Joel. And I really don't know how, no, I do know how this got brought up in conversation now. Daryl's talking about the poor quality of hot dogs we have today. Okay, so that's how the conversation started, and then it went from downhill. So, not downhill, it went better from there. So here's the deal with meat of strangled animals. The first day I went deer hunting, Craig Rossman's father took me out. I went with Craig and went with his dad, Chris, who's now passed away. But we go out and we go hunting. And I'd never been deer hunting before in my life. He said, now, John, if you shoot the deer, anybody know what you do? If you shoot the deer, just stop. Wait 10, 15 minutes before you move. I'm like, well, why, Chris? Why do I want to wait? Anybody know why we want to wait? Huh? So it'll bleed out. We want that deer to go lay down calmly, nicely, and bleed out. Now, I don't want to make everybody, sick here, talking about blood and animals and stuff. But why would I want the deer to bleed out as opposed to me chasing out all over the place and getting the deer all stressed out? Huh?
It'll take longer. You have to suffer longer.
It'll take longer. It'll suffer longer.
Won't the meat quality not be as good?
The meat quality. Okay, so here we go. And now I'm going to bring in Joel's topic of conversation yesterday. He's talking about, and I can't remember who he said, Daryl, if you heard that conversation or not, about maybe it was an uncle that used to slaughter his pigs. And before he'd slaughter the pigs, he'd take a loaf of bread, he'd pour a bottle of whiskey on that loaf of bread. The pig would eat the whiskey and the loaf of bread, get nice and calm and sleepy, and then he'd slaughter the hog. And it was the best tasting pork he's ever had. So I'm paraphrasing what Joel said. Now, it wasn't the whiskey and it wasn't the bread. Does somebody know what it was? The animal was calm. And so I'm trying to figure out, well, after Mom asked the question, why can't we eat strangled animals? I go online. It's scientifically proven that if the animal is stressed before slaughter, it produces hormones in its body. Okay, stressful hormones that get passed down to the end consumer. There have been studies done on this. It's not just that the meat tastes different. It's that the meat has a different effect on the consumer, the person who actually eats the meat. Okay, and some of those things are, where's the study here? Early menstruation in females, sexual problems in the people who consume them. Where's the one? Young men had problems of another nature, and that is the development of breasts. So, obviously not full-blown breast here, but just so you understand, these things can pass down to the person eating it. So, looking at the dietary restrictions that the Jews had, when they made animal sacrifices, the priest had special requirements for his knife, but the priest would approach the animal from behind and come up and slit the animal's throat in front. The animal was calm the entire time. Now you think, why God? Why do we have these rules? Well, now we understand the fact that if that animal's stressed, the meat is different, and the effects on the body of the person eating the meat is different. That's why they didn't want strangled animals. God wanted the blood to be removed from the strangled animals. So I'm going back to Mom's question. If Chick-fil-A, I have no clue what they do for their slaughtering process, KFC, Popeye's chicken, I don't know, you name it, whatever it is. If they are, from my limited understanding, if they're just breaking the neck of the chicken, then we probably should not be eating it. I don't know why. Based on the hormones, the stress of the animal, perhaps. If they're cutting off the neck, letting it bleed out, I think we're okay. But anyway, I'm sorry to go into depth about that one, but I thought it was an interesting topic, at least worthy of conversation. And all the pagans at that time, or many of those pagans at the time, were involved in all these things. Sexual immorality, drinking blood, eating strangled animals, and eating food obviously offered to idols. So they were doing all those things, so God wanted to put a stop to it. So that was the Council of Jerusalem. Now, here's the next topic. We fast forward one chapter. Paul has got his mentor or mentee, Timothy. And Paul and Timothy are getting ready to go on a missions trip. And they're getting ready to go on a missions trip to Jewish areas. Now, Timothy, his mom was Jewish, his dad was Greek. So he's half Jewish. But since his dad was Greek, Timothy was never circumcised. Does Timothy need to get circumcised? Council of Jerusalem says no. Gentiles don't need to be circumcised. Paul has Timothy get circumcised. This is after the Council of Jerusalem. So the question I have is now, when do we follow, or how, when, and why do we obey rules that we don't have to follow? How, when, and why do we obey rules that we don't have to follow? Timothy, a non-Jew, is going into Jewish territory. He knows that if he would be circumcised, he might get more reaction from the Jewish people. He knows he doesn't have to, but he thinks, hey, if it's going to make me reach out to more people, I'm happy to do it. So he is obeying a rule that he doesn't have to follow. Here's a classic example I've given probably several times. If I go over to Germany, okay, and I'm trying to minister the gospel to Germans, East Germans that were grown up under Russian territory, they have no clue about Christ, and they're not Christians. If I tell those Germans, if you drink, you can't be a Christian, how much success do you think I'm going to have? Zero. Germans is part of their culture. Is it a sin to drink? No, it's not a sin to drink. Jesus' first miracle was turning water to wine. It's not a sin to drink. If I go to Jamaica, an entirely different culture, the Jamaicans believe that Christians do not drink. So if I would go to Jamaica and trying to spread the gospel, would I sit down and have a beer with those Jamaicans? No. Well, why? I know I'm allowed to do that. I don't have to restrain myself. The gospel tells me I don't have to do it because I'm trying to reach people. The biggest synopsis of this story when Paul had Timothy circumcised is the following. It's the mature Christians, not the immature Christians, that need to adapt. If I can do something to help spread the gospel as mature Christians, we should do that. Maybe that means abstaining from alcohol. Maybe that means becoming circumcised. Maybe that means having to wear a suit and tie if I go to a certain culture. And I don't like wearing suit and ties. But I would do it if that's what's required. I used to tell everybody I would wear a pink tutu if it would lead other people to Jesus. Thankfully, I don't think that would lead anybody to Jesus. But I would do it. Timothy was willing to be circumcised. I would be willing to wear a pink tutu. What would you be willing to do to help lead others to Christ? That's food for thought for this week.